May I speak in the name of our loving, liberating, and life-giving God. Amen. Please be seated. There are a lot of expressions for it: calling someone out, making it plain, a come to Jesus moment, a confrontation. Think about the people in your life who have at one point or another expressed their concern for, or frustration with, or disappointment in you in a way that actually allowed you to see what they were describing more clearly, to see yourself more clearly, and make a different, more intentional choice around that particular behavior moving forward. Maybe it was your own child who pulled you aside after a dinner with some of her friends and explained that when you make a joke about how incomprehensible the LGBTQ alphabet soup is, what her friends who are at that table, who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer hear, is that you are willing to learn the name of every team in the National Football League, but can't muster the tiniest bit of interest in their lived experience, enough to learn 5 little words. Maybe it was the friend who stopped over for a visit and then, in a moment of quiet, mentioned, with such love and concern, that she'd noticed you seemed to drink a bit too much the last few times your family met up for dinner and had been slurring your speech every time she called after 5 and asked if you were really doing okay. Maybe it was a colleague who pointed out that your tone with young people in the office was noticeably condescending and it was not appropriate. Think, conversely, of the times you have found yourself in the difficult position of initiating such conversations. In cases of great concern for people you love, bring to mind the angst, how hard it was to find the right moment. I'll bring it up today. Yes, definitely today. Only to find hours, days, and weeks slipping through your fingers. How concerned you were the other person would misunderstand. How aware you were that this could either be the end of the relationship or the best thing you ever did for it. In cases of great frustration or offense, bring to mind the outrage, how hard it was to understand where this person could be coming from, how they could justify using that word, saying those things, being so selfish, and how you weighed whether or not it was worth saying anything at all. Having tough, honest conversations like this is hard among the most intimate of friends and family, and it is even harder, if not impossible, when the person who has done wrong is your boss, your priest, your mentor, your teacher, your elected official. So it may come as no surprise that, well, you know, all those people you just brought to mind who have blessed you by holding up a mirror at a critical juncture in your life, well, King David just didn't have anyone like that. Maybe he did at some point in his life. Perhaps his brothers or his father could have called him to account when he was but a simple, humble shepherd boy, but those days were long gone. Having a come-to-Jesus moment with a friend is not quite the same thing as speaking truth to power. And as David's power grew and grew and grew, authorized not only by the people but by Yahweh, God's own self, those around him slowly stopped saying anything when he made the occasional racist comment. Eyes were cast down when he bullied his assistant, but no one said anything. And perhaps there was some muttering at the quartz water jug about the swearing, but it went no further. The few people who did try to express their concerns were dismissed or diminished, belittled and betrayed, so that eventually those around him were sufficiently discouraged from following in their tracks. This seems to be a rather universal phenomenon, something about power corrupting. There's even a lovely children's tale about this, first published in 1837 by Hans Christian Andersen, in which a king commissions a couple of very convincing weavers to create the most distinguished, most elaborate, most beautiful clothes ever seen out of a special fabric that's invisible to those in his court unfit for their office. As the weavers set up shop in the castle and went to work, everyone peeking into the window was alarmed to realize they couldn't see the beautiful threads. No one wanted to say anything, afraid of being found out themselves, so they assured the king that progress was being made. The finest of suits, sir, truly. Only when the king was finally presented with his stunning new outfit, it turned out he couldn't see anything either. Nada. Zilch. But rather than admit this, or acknowledge that he had been swindled, he undressed, made a show of putting on his newest, most expensive costume, and headed to the much-anticipated red carpet event, where no one quite knew what to say until a child pointed out that the king was naked, exposed in every sense of the word. When we find him this morning, David is at a critical junction in his life and his reign. Up until this point, his star has been rising. Israel is flourishing, expanding, his power and his reach both growing ever further. But then, as we heard a few weeks ago, he stops doing what kings do. He stays home when kings go out to battle. He rests when kings are reaping. And more importantly, he stops using his power for what it was intended. His power was given to him to unify Israel, to draw God's people closer to God, to help them walk more fully in the ways of God's law. And instead, David uses it to use the wife of one of his best soldiers, Bathsheba, whom he gets pregnant. And then he uses it to attempt a massive cover-up. And when that fails, he uses it to have her innocent husband murdered so that she can come into his household and the crown can avoid a scandal. Surely, we might think, someone must have noticed what David had been up to. Someone must have said something. There were the messengers sent to get Bathsheba, who might have stepped outside but would still have heard her screams. There were her handmaids, who must have noticed that something was wrong when she returned to her home and rushed back up to finish her bath. There were the soldiers who brought Uriah back from battle and must have wondered why. And then there was Joab, the army commander, made complicit in David's ploy, who ultimately contrived the innocent husband's death. David was sneaky, but he was also sloppy, and his little secret wasn't all that secret after all. But no, it turns out no one said anything. There was no close confidant, no friend, no brother to sit him down and say, "Look, I love you, man, but this is not okay." And so that uncomfortable duty fell to Nathan, whom God sent to David in the wake of this calamitous affair. Now, Nathan was a prophet, which means his job, his calling, involved calling people to account, holding space for these hard, humanizing, holy conversations. Being a prophet is, to put it mildly, a daunting call, which is part of why most every prophet in the Bible initially tells God, "Thanks, but I'm a little busy right now," when God first comes a-knocking. But Nathan was the closest thing David had to a friend. He'd become something of a go-between for the king and Yahweh. And while they probably didn't go out drinking together on Friday nights, they weren't strangers and likely felt some mutual respect for one another, which is part of what the parable Nathan brings to David, which is part of what makes the parable Nathan brings to David so searing. He knows David well enough to know he can't simply say to him, "You have sinned against the Lord," and point out all of David's transgressions, because David won't be able to hear that. And the point isn't for Nathan to say you have sinned. After all, both Nathan and God already know this, but to help David see it for himself. So Nathan, like another prophet who will come generations later, uses a story to illuminate the present situation, to shed light on what David is not yet willing to see. He tells him of two men, one rich, with many flocks and herds, great wealth, tremendous power and privilege. The other poor, desperate, who owned only one lamb, a small and gentle thing that had become his only companion in a cold and cruel world. One day, a traveler comes to visit the rich man, who, even though he has much, does not want to take an animal from his vast flocks to feed his guest, and instead steals the beloved lamb from the poor man, cooks it, and offers it up on a platter for dinner. David's anger is kindled. He is filled with righteous indignation. What right has this man? What a terrible, selfish, short-sighted thing to do. He should be put to death, and the poor man restored fourfold for this loss. David is not without compassion, not without wisdom, but he has blind spots. And now that Nathan has awakened the king's compassion, his concern, helped him see in another what he cannot see in himself, now that some of the king's barriers are down, he gets to the point. You, he cries, you are the man. This terrible deed, this horrible violation, it is yours. You are guilty of it, and I see it, and God sees it. There is nowhere to hide. Your secret is out in the open. Your darkness is plain as day. And surely David felt like the king preening proudly on the red carpet in nothing but his polka dot boxers, completely exposed. But Nathan doesn't stop with berating David for the wrong he has done to Uriah and Bathsheba. He goes on behalf of God, to point out the more foundational offense, the wrongful use of the power and wealth and privilege given him by God for God's purposes. God's, not for the fulfilling of David's lust, not for the satisfaction of David's desires, but for the flourishing of God's people. I anointed you over Israel, God reminds him, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added that much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in God's sight? Ouch. Talk about someone making it plain. Now, David clearly deserved this. But one of the things I find most remarkable about this story is his response. David does not get defensive. He does not try to explain. He does not attack Nathan's character. He doesn't try to minimize or justify his actions. He says instead, simply, I have sinned against the Lord. He acknowledges his wrongdoing. He repents. We have precious few models for honest, hard, loving, hopeful conversations in our public discourse today. So I think it's important to see in this parable not only David's shame, but God's hope. David sinned against God, against Bathsheba, against Uriah, against everyone who put their trust in him as king. He's a criminal, multiple felony counts. He deserves a life sentence at best. But God doesn't send prophets into our world simply to point out the error of our ways. God sends prophets into our world to remind us that we are capable of something different, something more, that when we have done wrong, God knows that we can do better. On August 28th, 1963, when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood before a sprawling crowd in Washington, D.C., he could have simply cataloged all the ways in which American society was guilty of systemic racism. The list would be long, and it would be searing, and it would be accurate. And there's a slim chance it might have made a handful of people realize the error of their ways. But instead, as a prophet, he stood before the crowd and said, I have a dream. I see something you may not yet see, you might not know is possible, you might have forgotten was your birthright, and I am here to remind you. The prophet's job is to make it plain, and we can only know how short we have fallen when we appreciate how great God's dream for us was in the first place. Nathan didn't need David to tell him he was right. He knew he was right. This wasn't about making a point or some power play. He didn't come to the king to degrade or demoralize him. He came to inspire him. He came to remind him who he could be, who he had been made to be, to call him out of himself, the wise, compassionate, courageous man he had once been and yet could be again. God saw David's sin, and God helped David to see it so that he could be freed from it. God has a dream for us. God sees when we fall short of it, and painful as it can be, God comes into our lives in quiet moments, in conversations with one another, in fits of inspiration, to remind us that not only is a different tomorrow possible, but a different today. You are the man, indeed. Give us eyes to see, O Lord, and ears to hear. Amen.